All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're diving into a really interesting and, you could say, provocative perspective on money, wealth, and the special role of silver. The source material we're looking at presents a pretty strong case, and we're going to break it all down to understand what it calls the silver signal.
So let's kick things off with a simple question the source wants you to ask yourself. Imagine someone offers you two things, a crisp $10 bill or a single silver half dollar from 1964. Which one do you take? Now, your first instinct might be to grab the $10, right? But according to the viewpoint we're exploring today, the correct choice challenges pretty much everything we've been taught about money.
And here's where we see the core of that challenge laid out, plain and simple. On one side, you have the $10 bill. The source doesn't even call this money. It calls it government-printed debt or even fake money. But on the other side, you've got that silver half dollar. That's presented as real, tangible, intrinsic wealth, something they even refer to as God's money, because you can't just create it out of thin air. Okay, so to really get where this is all coming from, we have to start with the problem. The source argues that the paper money we use every single day, what's called fiat currency, has a massive fundamental flaw. The entire argument is really built on this classic economic idea called Gresham's law. So what is that? Well, it basically says that bad money always drives good money out of circulation. When you have two types of currency, people will always spend the one they think is less valuable, the bad money, and they'll hoard the one that has real intrinsic worth, the good money. The good stuff just disappears. And you know what? The source says we saw this happen right in front of our eyes. Think about it. Up until 1964, our dimes, quarters, and half dollars were made of 90% real silver. That was the good money. But then in 1965, the government switched to cheaper metals like copper and nickel. And what happened? Poof, all those silver coins just vanished from circulation. People knew which ones were actually valuable, so they pulled them out and saved them. Fast forward to today, and the scale of the issue, according to this perspective, is just staggering. The source claims that the government is now creating $1 trillion of this bad money every 90 days. All of it created out of thin air with absolutely no hard assets to back it up. And this quote really gets to the heart of the matter. It's all about purchasing power. The argument isn't that silver has gotten so much more valuable over the decades. No, the idea is that the silver itself hasn't changed. It's the dollar that has lost its value. It's become nearly worthless because there are just so many more of them in existence. All right, so if paper money is the problem, what's the solution? Well, this brings us to the next part of the argument, which points us directly toward hard assets, and specifically to silver. Now, the case for silver starts on a pretty philosophical level. When the source calls silver God's money, it's trying to get at this idea of permanence. It's not something a government can just decide to print more of. It's a natural element. It was here long before us, and it'll be here long after we're gone. It's totally outside the political system. But it's not just about philosophy. There's a really practical side to this too. You see, silver isn't like gold where most of it just sits in a vault somewhere. Silver gets used. It's essential for industry. It's in our electronics, our solar panels, you name it. And here's the kicker. Because it's used in such tiny amounts, the source argues it gets burned up. It ends up in landfills, and it's just too expensive to reclaim it all. So the usable supply is actually shrinking all the time. And this is a really, really important distinction the source makes. It says it's one thing to own physical silver, a coin or a bar you can actually hold in your hand. They see that as a real insurance policy. But that's totally different from owning paper silver, like an ETF. The source views that as just a derivative, a promise of silver held by somebody else. They go so far as to call it a fake asset. Okay, so we have a currency that's losing value and a hard asset that's both timeless and being consumed by industry. This all leads us to the main idea here. What exactly is this silver signal? Well, it's all about the collision between supply and demand. And this chart really paints the picture, doesn't it? On one hand, you've got industrial demand for silver just skyrocketing to record highs. But on the other hand, you have that usable supply that's constantly being used up and thrown away. It's this growing gap between what we need and what's available. That's the signal. So who's using all this silver? Well, the source points to three huge drivers. You've got massive industrial demand from countries like China. You have the whole green energy revolution. Solar panels need a ton of silver. And of course, it's still a critical component in pretty much all of our electronics and tech gadgets. And then there's another piece to this puzzle, according to the source. It claims that while central banks are quietly buying up gold to protect their own wealth, they almost never talk about silver to the public. This is framed as part of the signal, too. Watch what they do, not what they say. So this all leads us to the final part of our breakdown. And this section is less about charts and numbers and more about a complete shift in how you think about money and wealth. The source has a pretty stark way of looking at the wealth gap. It argues that most people work their whole lives to collect more fake money, dollars. But the rich, they play a different game. They work to acquire assets, like silver. It's not about how many dollars your silver is worth today. It's about how many ounces you have. So how do you actually make that mental switch? The material suggests these practical steps. First, get the phrase, "I can't afford it," out of your vocabulary. Instead, start asking, okay, how can I afford it? The idea is that this little switch flips on your brain's problem-solving engine. And finally, you start to see saving silver not as a purchase, but as a discipline, something you do consistently over time. And that brings us right here to the final question that ties this entire argument together. The source material really wants you to think about this. Is real wealth measured in dollars, or is it measured in ounces? It forces you to take a step back and question what wealth even means. Is it a number that can be printed into oblivion, or is it something real, something timeless that you can hold in your hand? A really powerful idea to leave you with.